when you think about culture, when you sell your control, the entire business, you better make sure that you vet the culture of the firm you're joining. It also matters how big they are, because the bigger they are, the more institutional they are, the less they're going to care about all the things you care about.
Welcome to Rise Up with Rise Growth Partners, the podcast created to inspire wealth advisors and elevate firms, one transformative idea at a time. Joe Duran and the Rise team share hard-won lessons from building top wealth management firms, showing you what it takes to create a lighthouse brand that inspires clients, attracts talent, and fuels growth. Together, we'll look at where the industry is headed so you can stay ahead of the curve. We're here to be the coach we wish we had along our journey. Let's dive in.
Hey, Joe. Welcome back to Rise Up.
It felt like spring a little bit this week. You know, I was out on the East Coast. It was sunny. It was 50 degrees. The week before, it was like 12.
Yes.
So it's been very nice and sunny. Beautiful out here in California always, but
yes,
nice to see.
I'm
How
here
you doing,
in the
Jen?
50s. It feels balmy compared to what this
spring in New Jersey.
Yes. So you wrote another nice article in CityWire. I loved the opening, so I'm going to share it with the audience. When they're handing out apple pie, go get a slice.
Yeah, that's
Start
my
by telling us more about that.
chairman and the biggest mentor in my life, Bob Doty. He's a PhD from University of Chicago, but he had very great expressions. He's like the Yogi Berra of my life. And he would always say, hey, you go raise money when they're handing out apple pie, you know, and it always stuck with me.
And there's no lack of pies right now.
No, there's a lot of people wanting to hand out apple pie. And so if there's ever been a time to think about raising capital, this is about as good a time as you could ever want, really. And it's really quite remarkable how the industry is evolving so rapidly. And the many choices you have, all the way from an absolute sale to a minority investor. So I thought it would be an interesting article for people, given the fact of my history.
And you've done it so many times.
Yeah, 35 years of doing it. So
on both sides of transactions, yeah. How has your thinking evolved through those experiences?
Well, you know, I've done 8 to 9 capital raises. A couple with the first one, which was called Centurion Capital. We sold it to General Electric. Those capital raises, by the way, were done at multiples of 7 to 8 times. Then we funded the beginning of United Capital. We sold to GE, and that was a very, very high multiple. Then we started working on United Capital. We were buying at 5 to 6 times, 100% integrated acquisitions, 2 times revenue. And we raised
I remember those days. And then when things got to 8 or 9, we thought it was high. And now look.
And by the way, we were raising capital in an 8x multiple. And they were underwriting an exit at 8 times multiple. So the arbitrage was we were buying at 5 times and we were selling at 8 times. Obviously, the whole market changed and everything changed when we sold to Goldman, obviously. We did about 5 or 6 raises over that, all minority investments. Even the summation of them never gave them control. So I thought it would be better to have 5 or 6 private equity partners that had smaller allocations, typically between 12 and 15% every time. And then the management team and the partners, the advisors, made up over 50% of the business. So I will share, look, the way to think about it is there's 3 ways to think about raising capital in an equity sense, turning your equity into cash. And by the way, there are a lot of debt choices, but I would say today, when people are willing to pay you the multiples, 14, 15, 16, for minority positions, go get the debt when it's cheaper and when they're not paying the premium on equity. So if you're going to choose between debt and equity, now is the time to pick equity because they're handing out apple pie. And the way to think about it is you're going to get the highest valuation for the most control. So if you sell outright, you're going to get a very different multiple because they can jam cost reductions on you. They can sell products to your clients. They can basically dictate what happens with your staff, keep them, let them go, drive pricing. It also means, by the way, that you want to be super careful about it, and we'll talk about that. The second choice is you take a control investor, which means a private equity or outside investor who owns more than 50%, where in effect, you get to have some voice. You get a multiple that's probably not as high as the full acquisition, because the full acquisition has all kinds of synergies that a private equity investor does not. But you get a lot more control. And then the lowest valuation will be a minority investor, but you keep the most control. So it's a seesaw between price and control. The gap has never been narrower. And that's the part why I say, look, why we formed Rise, and this is not an advertisement for Rise, why we formed it is I'm like, look, there's never a better time to receive private equity investments in minority position. But you get so little because the quality of the private equity firms coming in is so bad at the 30, 40, $50 million check size. The really good investors want to cut 200 and 300 million, which are control positions of really big firms. So I thought these $1 billion to $10 billion firms are not getting the kind of money they should get, which is why we partnered with a world-class tier one private equity group. But they're also not getting what they need the most, which is help and advice. So that was the idea. But again, back to the idea that if you're going to raise money, there's a trade-off between control and price.
Right. So there's so many times we talk about price, but this article goes much deeper on other things that really matter to founders and leaders of firms. 3 you speak about specifically are culture, business strategy, and financial control. So I thought we would dive a little deeper on each one.
Yeah, and we'll do a pros and cons of the 3 versions of things you can do: an absolute sale, a control sale, which means you're selling more than 50%, and a minority investor. And of course, there are all kinds of flavors of this. But the way I'd like you to think about this is, nobody ever says, I have never met the advisor in the 100 and plus transactions I've done where they say price is the most important thing to me, because we're all fiduciaries. And I don't know the advisor who I would want to partner with who doesn't care deeply about their staff and about their clients and won't sell them down the river. But
I agree. I mean, most of them have been with their clients for 20, 30 years, many of their team members for years, and it really does matter to them.
And so when you think about culture, when you sell your control, the entire business, you better make sure that you vet the culture of the firm you're joining. It also matters how big they are, because the bigger they are, the more institutional they are, the less they're going to care about all the things you care about, the more compromise you're going to have to do. One of the things I know is if you join a firm on the rise, you're much likelier to be able to shape that culture, to have your culture affect the culture of the big enterprise. But the reverse is true. You join a big enterprise, your culture, and I know from joining 2 big firms, I couldn't stand, again, nothing against GE. We sold to a group called Jeffa. It was GE Capital, the financial group at GE Capital. And for me, the culture was so not working for me. Now, I didn't want to sell. My partner, Bob, who we talked about the pie, was the one who wanted to sell. So we did. But I will tell you, I had a 5-year contract. I lost it 3 months before I was like miserable. I was 34 years old. And when we sold to Goldman, I loved the DNA of the people. I actually really liked the culture internally. It was a very merit-based, outcome-based
high
firm.
Performance.
But there's no way we could have affected the culture. It didn't matter who United Capital was. We became a reflection of the Goldman Sachs culture. And that is true in any enterprise, except the firms that joined us when we were building United Capital absolutely shaped the DNA of our firm. Now, we had a very strong ethos. So when you're joining, think about that. If you're taking a control investor, people would say it's not going to affect your culture. Well, guess what? It will. Because the control investor determines budget and comp and what success looks like. They build a business plan with you. That will make it impossible for you to retain the culture you had before. Now, you'll have a big voice. You'll get to determine how those things get affected. But that's very different if you take a minority investor who really has a voice at the table but doesn't set the agenda. As soon as you know who's in control of comp And what determines outcomes? Our industry is 70% comp, right? So whoever decides that sets the culture. So you bring in the wrong private equity investor who's a control investor, you're not going to be able to say how much leverage you put on the balance sheet. You don't get to say how much acquisitions or what kind of acquisitions you do. And your culture is really not in your hands anymore. So if you're going to join a firm that has a control investor and you're going to sell completely to them, you better learn about the culture of the firm that's invested in them, because it's not owned by the PE, by the CEO. That culture is being set by the rules and determinations of how people get paid.
Okay, let's move to business strategy.
Yeah.
That too is heavily influenced.
Well, obviously, if you're selling to an enterprise completely, they are determined on their own strategy. You are a part, you're a spoke in a wheel. And that wheel, if it's big, a big enterprise, one of the big mega firms, you're a tiny spoke with thousands of spokes. You almost don't matter. If you're in a smaller firm, you're going to be a meaningful spoke. And I remember when we were building United Capital, those first advisors had a huge voice in the shaping of our direction.
Yes.
As we got bigger, the advisors had a loud voice, but each individual advisor had a smaller voice.
Right.
And so it was
the ones in earlier, I've
have a much
experienced
bigger
that
influence,
too. Yeah, and they can help shape and influence in a meaningful, very meaningful way.
And that's why, again, it's exciting to
in
me,
in their own geography.
Yeah, in their own geography, but also they get to shape, like, how should we think about who comes in? We used to have a veto power for our original advisors to vet who came in, that they felt good about who was coming in. After a while, they started to trust our management team knew what good looked like, but you get to shape it a little. And that matters.
And often it's welcomed, because as we know, these firms have quite small leadership teams.
Yeah, so I would say, like, look, if you're joining United Capital, you're the captain of your ship. You get to salute and wear the uniform, but you determine the direction. That strategy, direction, where your boat is going, if you've given up, control is no longer yours. And especially true if you do a complete sale. It's less so, again, depending on the size of the firm. If you take a control investor, you have a voice in the strategy. They probably invested in your vision. But if they don't like it, if they don't think it's performing, if they don't think it is where it needs to be, most importantly, if you don't have control, leverage how you think about what kinds of acquisitions. And look, money typically wants to move fast. Every PE investor at the outside has a 6 to 7 year window. So they want you to do as many acquisitions as possible. They're not going to have to deal with a cleanup because they have a window. And so it's not about building the most beautiful thing you can. Likely, it's simply about get to the best, like fastest growth. Let's worry about somebody else. We'll do a sponsor-to-sponsor deal, and somebody else can clean it up if there's something to clean up there. And I will talk in a new episode about that whole issue and what it means.
Yes.
But then lastly, if you have a minority investor, you get to determine the strategy.
You're talking now a little bit more about that financial control, because it gives firms that have a lot of hunger to grow that ability to take those steps towards that rapid growth with an eye to another future event, which I think is
when
really
you think about the choices here, what you're doing with a control position is you've given up all of your upside. If you take cash and equity, you basically have transferred your equity into the equity of the enterprise. If the enterprise is already at hundreds of billions, how much upside can there possibly be?
Right.
Like, they're going to have to subsume so many firms.
Especially when most firms struggle with organic growth.
Of course. So you are basically transferring your upside. What does that mean? It means that people who are willing to sell to one of these large enterprises that are already massive have very little belief in their own upside, which means that there is almost certainly none of the acquisitions have an organic strategy. Because if they had an organic strategy that worked, they'd take a control investor, a minority investor, because they want to keep their own upside. Now, the difference is if I have a lot of vision and I bring in a control investor, but I really want to control when and how and the terms of my exit, you really cannot take a control investor because they will determine timing, budget, whether you do it or not, what success looks like, how much leverage. Again, and I don't want to understate the importance of debt on your balance sheet because they might they can also choose how big a distribution they want to make. We're going to take on a bunch of leverage, take out 100% of our money, and now we're just with the house's money, and you've got all the risk on your equity, but they've taken all their original principal out. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It's how they make their living. But you better know, if you're selling to a large enterprise, what does their balance sheet look like? And if you're in taking a majority investor, you're not going to be able to control the major decisions. When you sell, what price you sell for, how much debt you get, when distributions happen. There'll be complicated tier share classes, which if you're selling control position, you better find out what your rights are. If you're selling to a smaller firm, you likely have a very loud voice. You probably get treated with the same equity structure as everyone else, other than a pref. And so it's very different. And then if you take a minority investor, you have the most likely economic outcome because you're keeping 70, 60, 70, 80% of the upside. You have more risk, of course. Just have more control. And if you have the right investor, they have a huge vested interest in your success. So if they're people who actually know what they're doing and you trust them and like them, they're going to help you sing. They're going to let you make the most money possible. They're also incented for you to have the best possible outcome.
They're
aligned. You have none of the conflicts of interest. Now, here's the dilemma. You want to take control, a minority investor who doesn't act like a controlled investor. And I've heard of some minority investors who put like controls on hiring any employee over 50,000 and what you could spend on marketing. Like, you have to make sure that when you take a minority investor, you actually give them minority rights, so you actually keep control of how you do things. So hopefully this was useful for people. I know we went longer than you said I should.
What final words of advice would you give to a founder or a team thinking about taking on
at number one, just know what you want. Take the time to understand what you want. Now, you can make the pie bigger, but you have to be considerate of the fact, if I take a minority investor, will my remaining pie, even though I gave up some, be even bigger? And you have to ask yourself, how do I feel about my culture? How do I feel about financial controls? How do I feel about setting the strategy for the business? And do my investors bring me something that allows my remaining pie to be more successful, even if the multiple is less? Because again, it's easy to focus on, well, if I go sell a control position, I'll get an extra turn or two. That is meaningless. If you have 80% of the remaining pie, that one being at 15 or 16 versus 18, it doesn't even matter. If you put it on a spreadsheet, you would literally see. And I knew this when I raised capital.
Especially because most of them want to keep going. They have a lot of passion for the business.
So, I know for myself, when I raised capital, I would, of course, scream and shout I wanted the highest multiple, but I knew it didn't matter. Especially, I wasn't taking any capital out. So it was all primary capital. I knew I was going to grow the stock price. I wanted to keep as much for us as possible, but it didn't really matter as long as I had the cash in my balance sheet, whether it was 15 or 14 or 10. And we raised capital literally at 8 times. It didn't matter. So the reality is, as long as you don't have too much leverage and you're an accretive acquirer and you know how to grow organically, and we loved having a brand. And our job now is to partner with firms who have great visions and turn it into reality. But hopefully this was useful. I know we went up for far too long. Maybe
it's always fun. It's always fun to talk about these things. And hopefully it was helpful for our viewers. And we'll see you next time.
All right, great. Thanks, Jennifer. Have a great weekend.
You too.
You are listening to Rise Up with Rise Growth Partners. If we helped you to rise up today, please subscribe to the show so you don't miss future episodes. Leave us a review to tell us what you loved, what topics you'd like to hear, and please share it with others in the industry. After all, we're here to rise up together.